Welcome, everybody, to the show. Today we are talking about professional wargaming as opposed to hobby wargaming that most of us are very familiar with. And we have here today three illustrious special guests. We have Andrew Olson from the Center for Naval Analysis. I got that right? The Center for Naval Analysis? Okay. And it's not Campaign for North Africa. We have Sebastian Bay of Georgetown University and other affiliations. And of course, we have Brant from the Armchair Dragoons, with whom you should all be intimately familiar at this point. Please check out the Wargaming events calendar in the video description. I'm going to put the ticker up because it is Ardwulf's Lair's 15th birthday this month, and you can get 10% off any order at Noble Knight Games by using the code Ardwulf15. That lasts all month, and you will have it. You'll see an email address if you want to reach out to me as well for whatever reason. But let's start with you, Andrew. I'll let you introduce yourself. Tell me what you're all about.
Sure. I'm glad to be with you. So I'm Andrew Olson. I'm an associate research analyst at Center for Naval Analysis. I'm also a graduate of Georgetown's Masters of Foreign Service program and professional wargaming designer alongside Sebastian.
And Sebastian, how about you?
Hey, my name is Sebastian Bay. I am also game designer and research analyst at the Center for Naval Analysis, also known as CNA. I also teach a game design course at Georgetown University.
And you have an upcoming game for us peasants who aren't tied into the military and don't have security clearance. So you have a security clearance not required game coming up, and we'll take a quick look at that later on in the show. Brant, how about you?
Yeah, so I'm not a CNA. Most folks know me as the editorial director and commander right over at the Armchair Dragoons. But I've worked in the professional world in the past, both as a recipient of the kinds of games that Sebastian and Andrew work on designing, as well as having worked on a couple of projects for the NSA and National Defense University, among others. It's a little further in my past, but one of the things the Dragoons like to do is try and help bridge that divide. And so we tend to talk a lot about the kinds of things Andrew and Sebastian do, even though we're a hobby-focused channel.
And I'll give you an opportunity to talk about some of the ways in which that interface happens a little later. But in the meantime, Sebastian, let me start with you. Tell us, how does that? How did you first get into the professional side of wargaming? Were you prior to that a hobby wargamer and became involved professionally, or did you just arrive from the head of Zeus, as it were, on the professional wargaming scene?
I did not come out of the head of Zeus. That would be a way cooler origin story, honestly. I was a hobby gamer before, but like most hobby gamers, I didn't know that was a profession you could do in DoD or as like a grown up. Honestly, I came to professional wargaming like most of us on our field in the DoD, which is by accident, by happy like circumstances. I was actually in Erbil in Kurdistan in Iraq at the time, right after I graduated from Georgetown as a grad student. And then I was doing some freelance reporting for Foreign Policy magazine at the time because I wanted to be a defense writer initially. And I was sort of waiting on a State Department job out in DC while I was doing these freelancing gigs. And then I got like horribly sick, unsurprisingly, right? As I was covering the refugee crisis and the IDP, like internally displaced persons crisis in Iraq at the time. This was in, 2015 in the fall. And I was there with an American medical charity. And I was like, oh man, I need a real job. With a 9-to-5 healthcare, the normal boring stuff. And I applied for like a spree of jobs. And one of them was as a wargame designer down at Quantico for the Marine Corps Warfighting Labs wargaming division. And I applied. I was like, hey, I know this. Like, I know the Marine Corps. I know how to do analysis. I could do storytelling. And I love games. Like, I could do this job. I did not do professional wargame design before that. And then they hired me. I went down to Quantico, and that was my first real entry into wargaming. And then eventually, I left the wargaming division to go to RAN, which is another federally funded research and development center, or FFRDC, in DC, where I did a lot more wargaming for the Air Force and the Army predominantly, where I did a lot of future concept stuff. And then eventually, after several years, I have come to where I sit now, which is CNA. which is another FFRDC. I would think of it as a special think tank for the Navy and Marine Corps, where I do most of my war game design work now.
Okay, great. Andrew, tell us about your entry into professional war game design.
Sure. Like Sebastian, I grew up playing a lot of hobby games, designed some games with friends, kind of on my own for kicks and giggles, as it were. In my first year in my Georgetown's master's program, I took a class with a professor by the name of Dr. Yuna Wong, a former colleague of Sebastian's as well. And she had us play some Matrix games, some very basic kind of professional gaming tools as part of that class, and introduced me to this as a whole world and professional world. I'm introduced to some people around Georgetown and around DC to kind of further my interest, designed some games for the State Department as an internship, and eventually took a class that Sebastian teaches at Georgetown called Basics of Wargaming. Designed a game there called Competition AI, looking at tech competition between the US and China. Then in the short time span, had some success. My team and I, two great other designers, were able to show it around DC a little bit and kind of brush up our chops that way. And then soon enough, I was thrust out into the cruel real world outside of academia and had to find a job. And eventually was grateful enough to land at CNA, where I've been for about 2 months now.
Awesome. And Brant, how does your life history intersect with professional wargaming?
So there's two different strands there. There's the part where I actually ended up in the professional wargaming world for a little while, and that goes back to the early 2000s, not long after I started showing up at Origins, back when Bayonet Games was still a thing. I got recruited to be a speaker at the Origins War College, and that turned into also being a speaker at Connections, one of the earlier Connections back in 2007, 8, 9. I was there for a couple of years. And one of those speaking gigs actually connected us with some of the guys at the National Defense University. That was the first of the bigger projects we worked on. A few years before that, again, Bayonet Games at Origins, one of the guys that split the booth with us early on had a project with the NSA that he brought me on board to help as a co-designer and playtest coordinator.
I thought you were going to say wet work specialist, but
yeah,
please continue.
So it was basically being a war game dude out there who at the time was still a serving National Guardsman. So folks were looking at, oh, hey, the guy's actually in the military. We can make all the National Guard jokes you want. That's fine. I've made plenty of them myself. But a guy who's actually in the military and doing wargaming stuff, let's get this guy on board and help out. And even some of the early Bayonet Games designs, some of the intent with those designs is very similar to what Sebastian was doing with Littoral Commander, which is, yes, it's a hobby game at heart, but with a lot of professional military considerations built in. It actually got picked up and covered by National Defense Magazine. Hey, here's this National Guard guy who designed a game to help with battalion and company level training, and it's pretty darn cheap. And we sold 0 additional copies as a result of that article, which is pretty disheartening. But I don't think the groundwork was laid for it quite yet, to where, Sebastian was able to take advantage of wargaming actually having a little more emphasis these days, 15 years later. In terms of the coverage that we do these days, I've never lost my interest in the professional wargaming space. And so now that I'm much more in the media and content creation space, I still want to make sure that the professionals get some coverage in the hobby realm, because I do think there's a lot of advantages to be gained from the cross-pollination between the two. And so that's one of the reasons why the Dragoons, we make it a point that we're bringing the pros onto our podcast episodes. We co-sponsor the Connections Online Conference. That is one of the many different Connections conferences. We've got a showcase coming up. It'll still be coming up by the time this goes live, that Andrew's one of the speakers at. So we try to keep a foot firmly planted in the professional realm to help with that exposure for the pros into the hobby world.
Okay, fantastic. All right, so I think what I'm getting here, and I knew about Brant and Sebastian prior to this discussion, but this is the first time Andrew and I have met face to virtual face, as it were. So I'll start with you, Andrew. We all seem to have some level of background in hobby wargaming. So how does that differ from professional wargaming, both methodologically and culturally? I mean, apart from the obvious thing that it's your job now and your deadlines mean something.
Yeah, so certainly some more stress as compared to your Sunday game session. Well, one of the, as with any kind of discipline, one of the classic questions is, what is wargaming? And nothing sure to toss red meat to a bunch of professionals is asking them to define what they do. In this case, what I'm thinking of by professional wargaming is kind of wargaming serious games with a educational or analytical purpose for kind of professional clientele. One of the things that separates a hobby game from a war game, it can be a variety of things, but one of which is the purpose to it. If you can think on a spectrum, kind of on the one end is purely educational, on the other hand is purely analytical. War games span that whole focus. So you could have a game which we're designing. We've got a lot of very specialized information that we need you to understand. And so we need a young lieutenant to play this tactical game, to understand commanding squad movement or calling for fires or other things that might be part of his or her job in the military. On the other end is a topic which we don't have all the information for, and we want to use the game as a way to further a research objective. So the games we do at CNA are all sponsor driven, as in someone has come to us as part of a wider research project, and we're running this game as a way to further that research project. So if we, making stuff totally up here, but if we were concerned about the effect of climate change on military readiness on some base somewhere, right? The question might be, how do you safeguard bases, right? For tidal waves. That there might be a whole research project on that, and we might run a game about investments, or might run a game about, and that's more about trying to figure out the area. A lot of the games that Rand has done are more of that analytical side. We're looking to the future. We don't know everything, and we're playing this game as a way to generate better questions by putting the best of our knowledge into mechanics and having everyone play around with the equities and the decision space so that we can come away with this with better research questions or things to do. Hey, it seemed to matter that this missile's got a longer range of fire. Let's check out if that assumption checks out. The red player was deterred by this action. Do we think in the future that's something to do? So I went a couple places there, but one of which the difference between hobby and wargaming is a little bit the purpose. We use a lot of the same verbiage. We use a lot of the same language about mechanics, about boards and pieces. So I think that's how I would take a stab at it. That being said, I'm only 2 months into the professional side of it, so Sebastian can step in and save me here if I'm way off base.
Sebastian, what would you like to add to that?
I would like to add that Andrew obviously had a great professor who taught him the right thing to say.
I mean, obviously.
In this moment. No, so Andrew hit it on the head, and a lot of it comes down to purpose, right? And the way I would sort of ground that for your audiences who are like, oh, I don't know what that means to be part of a wider project is, as a designer, your purposes, whether they be analytical or educational, drive the kind of abstractions you're willing to tolerate and willing to make, and the kind of research that you need. So what does that mean, right? So for commercial games, you're trying to entertain, provide some kind of cool insight, and this is one of the things I will say is that a lot of good commercial designers who make really rigorous, well historically researched, good games. Like, they're really well founded, right? So I wouldn't say it that way, but sometimes, right, you have to make choices commercially because of box weight, because of the number of players, number of pieces, how long you want your game to be. Like, our professional games can range from 2 hours to like a week plus days, right? Right now I'm designing a game that is like 10 days plus, right? So those are like, we're allowed.
That sounds fantastic.
Yeah, so it sounds fantastic, right? But it's not something you would do for a commercial game, right? Like, you don't want to be like, oh, I'm gonna design a game where the average time requires is 10 days and you need 50 people, right? But that might be the baseline.
Challenging. 10 days is totally pedestrian in my space, but
yeah. So so a lot of times it's about why the purposes and the implications of those purposes have, right? So our sponsors have various needs, whether that is saying, hey, I need to train 50 majors on a staff to understand this sort of plan, right, in this kind of contingency, right? And then I need it to be this level of granularity, which means that we're having 10-hour plus days, and you need to design a game that way. Other times, it's like my IU fishing game with the Pew Charitable Trust, where it's a couple people, right, less than a dozen, at a table that looks a lot like a commercial game. It has pieces, rigid rule sets, victory conditions, and many things will align. So often that Venn diagram can sort of oscillate of how much they overlap, right? But from a perspective of a designer, the way I would describe it is the purposes inform the abstractions and the design choices you will make, right? And the type of players you will get at the table.
Brant, would you like to add anything based on your varied experiences?
Yeah, first of all, I think it's funny that Sebastian thinks that a week-long playtime is going to be a turnoff somehow to some of these hardcore grogs. Because
yeah, but 50 people is a problem because I don't think there's 50 people on the planet to play some of this stuff.
That so, might be the 50 people part certainly a challenge, but the week-long playtime, that's Winterfest.
Yeah, exactly. At the professional space, 50 people could found to be ordered to play.
Yes,
that wouldn't be a big problem.
Yeah, I think Sebastian Andrew really nailed it in terms of the purpose is a key thing. And I think that's something that a lot of the hobby guys miss, is that the very easy conceptualization is that we're training something, right? We learned how to do company level patrol tactics. And so let's put all those pieces on a map and let's test that out and make sure that we understand how that works. That's an obvious use case that everybody kind of understands. But once you get much, much higher up in the space where Andrew and Sebastian have lived at times with some of those high level games and some of the stuff that the National Defense University does. I wasn't a part of those, but I saw some of them in action, where you've got literally members of Congress around the table. The purposes for which you are playing those games are very different. In many cases, you're playing them, as Sebastian mentioned, to generate better questions, to try to understand what it is you do need to go investigate in the future. I will say, for hobby game folks walking by a table, looking at a professional war game going on, there's three things they're going to notice that are commonly significantly different than what we're used to in the hobby game space. One, virtually every professional war game at that level is a mediated game. You've got some sort of game master who's the ringmaster of the circus. Usually multiple people. And in those 50 player games that Sebastian's talking about, I mean, your white cell was what, 8 folks, easy, maybe more. So you're going to have a handful of folks helping just execute the game that are not players. They're the GM team, for lack of a better term. The other thing you're going to notice is an almost disappointingly small rule set. Professional audiences don't have the time to absorb an OCS level rule set. They're just not going to. Even 8 pages is going to scare people off. I mean, you need a folio, and you still need a game master to help actually execute it, because the professional audiences actually have day jobs that aren't just playing the games, and they don't have the time to fully absorb the rule set. And that's one of the reasons why you need the white cell, that GM team there to help mediate things. And those are two big differences. The third one Sebastian already alluded to is your player count. You are almost never going to have a professional war game that is just a 2-player game. You'll have a lot of games used in a training context that's just 2 guys sitting around, sort of sets and reps and exercising the brain there in some military decision making. When it comes time to actually execute these things, whether it's one of the steps in the military decision making process or those big analytical games that these guys do, you're not doing that with just 2 people around the table. You're bringing in a bunch of folks as a part of that, and that's where your player count goes up. So as a hobby guy looking in from the outside, short rule sets, mediated games, big player counts.
So let me, there was a couple of interesting things to me that were touched on in those answers. So let me ask about professional war game design as sort of a project management exercise. It's like, I mean, I imagine a lot of the design techniques and tools map pretty closely to things we might see in the commercial space. But like in terms of like how these projects originate, I mean, how does that work? Does like Senator so-and-so come down and say, I think you guys should study this particular question, and you guys build a game based on that? Is it more of a freeform thing where project ideas are created and roundtabled and then submitted to whoever? How does that work? Let me start with you, Andrew.
Sure. So it depends for each shop. I would happily design a game for Senator so and so if they've got a funding line for us to support this research, or if they've got an internship that I can go work for them. CNA is a federally funded research and development institution. It's a fancy way of saying we're like a special think tank, and we have some contracts, particularly with the Navy and the Marines. So a lot of our games come through institutions associated with those. We do have work with other national security and government organizations, but it's always the sponsor led for our kind, or not always, but the majority is sponsor led stuff. And so there'll be a research project going on. They want us to look at one thing or the other, whether that's a big strategic question or a more mundane question, personnel or manning. And then the CNA or the sponsor decides that they would like a war game as part of that. That they think that their decisions would be buffed through the implementation of our skill, through implementation of this particular analytical methodology. From the project management sense, I laughed a little bit as within CNA, there is a role called a project director for all of our games. We have a lead designer and a lead a project lead, a project director who does all of the paperwork and the making sure that everyone's turning in the things on time and hitting all the steps along the way of our kind of internal roadmap of has the sponsor agreed to all the objectives? Have we what have you agreed to the structure and the format? Have we do the cards actually not say that this is an important character, not an impotent character? All of the kind of important project management side. So again, sponsor usually comes to us as part of a wider analytical project, and then we support that and design a game to either support the question or educate as part of that endeavor.
Great. So let me ask you. So I'll start with Sebastian. You can add anything to Andrew's response that you like as well. What is the kind of the project timetables look like? Is it generally weeks or months, or do you have like total war level projects that you've been laboring to complete for the last 15 years?
I wish we had 15-year projects. That would be awesome. So one thing I will add to what Andrew said is that majority of our projects, I would say, are like long-standing relationships that we have with organizations. Sometimes this means that they're recurring games, right? Like a game that is part of a series, ear to ear, with like the same organization and CNAs are collaborating on a game. Other times they are just relationships that we have with particular commands or units or headquarters, and then we rely on each other to be like, okay, so this year we did, last year we did this, and this year let's try to do this, right? But I would also say a good chunk of our games are also what we call BD led or business development led, in which we are looking for new people, new ideas, new people, new organizations, new topics to collaborate on. So myself and a couple other of the senior designers on the team will do a lot of the BD work to get new ideas. One of the reasons I do a lot of BD is because I design a lot of our games and I would like to choose the games I design. So before something is thrusted upon me, I would rather go out and hunt something and be like, I have a great, interesting idea, or hey, I want to really work with this organization, whether it's on a particular cyber game or let's say a logistics game or whatever. So I want to go hunt down a topic, right? And then we will create a proposal together and then create a game. So it can go either way. What the split is often that, I mean, it'll change year to year. In terms of timelines, what we say to our sponsors often is that we would like to have 6 to 8 months to do a full game, right? This is the assumption that you have one or maybe two iterations of a game, that we're building this thing from scratch, right? That it is a fully bespoke game made for you, tailor made, from research, development, design, play testing, all the way to execution. And then also and then the report will probably tack on like 5 months or so. So usually a fiscal year-ish looking project, right? So about 6 to 8 months for the game design to execution, about 4 to 5 months for the report that follows up after it, right? That's your typical template. Does that always happen? No, right? Because there are people who are like, hey, I need a game like in 2 months. And you're like, well, let me tell you all the risks you're going to take for doing that in 2 months. And these are the things we have to say to you, right? And also saying, hey, there are going to be holes. There are going to be, you know what I mean, issues with the design. It's not going to be as play tested as much, so forth. Other times we have recurring series games, which are awesome because each year the game evolves and adapts, right? So you have this really long ongoing series that adapts year to year. Those tend to be more rare on our side because our sponsors have so many interesting ideas, so many interesting problems to tackle that we only get a couple whacks at it usually at a time.
Brant, do you have anything to add?
The timelines tend to vary widely depending on when the sponsor gets around to bothering to ask for the game. It's really, even the recurring one that we did with the NDU, we worked on it 3 years in a row. We would get the call in March. All right, guys, we need you to start ramping up for the August execution of this thing. And it was a part-time gig for, I mean, it would have been awesome to be in, Sebastian Andrews' shoes where that was their full-time day job. Our crew was working on it as a second job on top of our day jobs. So, when you're working part-time and you've got 4 month, 4-month call to say, get this ready to go, you're scrambling sometimes. And a lot of it, you're dependent on the sponsor. Like, we need data from you guys to plug into the model you asked us to build. If the data doesn't show up on time, they still end up blaming us. So it's project management ultimately is what it comes back to. I mean, my day job is project management. I know what it looks like. And there's a lot to it. The research is far more interesting, but ultimately it's a project management exercise, right? It's calendar Tetris.
If your listeners are interested in learning a little bit more about the kind of questions we ask, you can go to the CNA gaming integration site. It does have some PDFs there about the questions we ask sponsors when they come to us with the game. We've hit a ton of them here. What's your objective? What's your timeline? Can't do. But
I will ask you for a link to that, and I can put it in the video description below. So
also,
let me.
One thing.
No, go ahead, Sebastian.
Is typically most designers will not be working on a single project at a time either. So depending on, we have these 3 roles, which is like business development, project director, and designer, and lead analyst. So those are like the 4 major roles on our team, and everyone will have like a D&D character, different attributes, right, and different strengths that they sort of like invest their skills and time to develop, right. For me, I am heavier on the design side. I really hate the PD portion of game design, right. So I design close to a dozen or more games a year. On various timelines. Others may only design, let's say, 3 or 4 games, but may PD for half a dozen games, right? So, or serve as lead analyst. So often it is not just like, hey, I'm designing a game for Brant and he gets my full attention for 8 months. No, like he is like one of 4 games that I'm juggling and trying to play calendar Tetris and finding time to play test and designing and so forth. It is difficult, right? And also at the same time, if you're like great with your design jujitsu, right, is like as I'm waiting for Brant to provide me information on this thing that I need to do the design, I'm working on Andrew's game to look at whatever because it's more further along and it's along its timeline. While I'm working for something for you, maybe we're still working on the questions, right? So there are a bunch of games working at different timelines, and you have to, as a professional game designer, that's one of your hardest challenges is to play that ability to jump in and out of game designs and still be really rigorous along the path.
Let me ask about this was touched on in an earlier answer, the research process that goes into professional war games, and without revealing any actual classified information, I'd kind of like to get some insight into how dependent these professional war games are on classified information. I assume that some of them are very dependent on classified information, and whatever we could tell without anybody getting in trouble, and the man in the black suit knocking on that door right behind me right now.
In my case, the data was all unclass on all the projects I was working on. It was being provided to us by the sponsor, and there was almost no research we had to do independently. We were there building the game engine and executing the game engine, and the research itself came from the sponsors. So in our case, we were a little lucky in that regard. And these guys have done a whole lot more of the more difficult research part.
I mean, I assumed that was because you were shifty and disreputable.
Well,
and
I'm not going to deny that.
They left the classified dossier out.
Yeah. So before Andrew jumps in, I will probably save him from this answer, which is it depends, right? So some of our games we have done lots of research already on it. Like for example, one of my specialties, even as a game designer, is operational and tactical warfighting, right? So most things we have done research on it before, and often is like a refresher, all right, and then revisiting some of the research we have done or narrowing down a particular element of war fighting or tactical engagement or something like that. But it's not like we have to research air defense and how ground combat works every single time, right? It's all about, often that's where the experience comes in handy, right? When you have the institutional expertise. Other times you also don't have to be an expert in the topic yourself as the game designer, right? The way I often describe it is that you are trying to do research to be fluent and dangerous enough on the topic, often to leverage and understand what true experts know, right? So I'll give an example for my Pew game. All right. So for the Pew Charitable Trust, we did an IU fishing game, which is illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. And I knew absolutely zero about IU fishing prior to the project and the game. And in the very beginning, I spent a month doing a crash course research, reading white papers, concept papers from the Coast Guard, reading articles, listening to podcasts, talking. We did subject matter discussions with actual Coast Guard people. We did talks with experts in IU fishing and fisheries and commercial fishing and all that stuff. And we did our homework, right? And often it is not to make me an IU fishing expert, but for me to be able to understand what other people have done already in the field, to oh, this is what they mean about these policy decisions, or why this should work in this game, right? Because as a game designer, your research is to understand and make sure you're representing the dynamics, right? Incentives and constraints pretty accurately, or at least reflectively enough that the players understand why the game works the way it does and why certain behaviors are punished and some behaviors are rewarded in the game. So that's a part of it, right? And then a lot of the research will also go towards the end, right? Just double check the things that we saw in the game. So if the game is analytical and we're trying to divine some questions or insights about the game topic, right? Let's say air defense, right? Or maritime logistics on islands, or whatever that may be, right? Then we have to be like, are the things that we observe in the game, the player decisions that we saw, supported by other research, right? You don't want to take what the game says on its own, right? It is part what Peter Perla says, the cycle of research, right? Of how do I check it with air defense models, right? With models and simulations and computer simulations. Do other research and case studies, historical or present day, support this outcome? All right. Can we talk to other experts? And you're doing this whole cycle of research, or at least parts of it within your own project.
Andrew, what would you like to add to that?
Oh no, I think my wonderful professor covered there that it depends on the annoying answer depends on what we need for the game, how much what kind of the kind of research we're going to use, whether it's classified or open, and also more importantly what audience we're trying to get this game in front of. There is I've heard mostly anecdotally, because I've only recently kind of been more on the classified side of things, that people often want a higher classification than is necessary, in the hopes that gets them better results. When the the difference is not important to the game. The level of specificity that you would get with the classified information, and so it depends. What we're looking at. What does this need? For example, the Pew game was obviously all open source because we're hoping to get it in front of people who don't. It's not for people. It's not for the spooks up at the CIA. It's for the Coast Guard and the fishing regulators and the Congress people to help them understand the topic. So whether it's classified or not depends on the questions we're asking. And then Sebastian covered a little bit of how we go about researching those things.
Part of that depends answer. Sorry, just real quick. Part of that depends answer goes back to what's the purpose of the game. Because if it's one of those analytical things that's designed to help generate questions, then you may not need a lot of classified anything to do. If it's essentially a glorified team building exercise, right? Let's practice our hurricane response before the hurricane actually hits. Then you're almost always dealing with unclass. But if you're dealing with acquisition decisions to be made over the next 10 or 15 years, then you may need classified data on weapons performance to help make those decisions. So part of that, it depends, goes back in large part to the purpose of the game. What is it we're trying to answer in the context of this war game? And that's going to drive where that data comes from.
So let me stipulate that if GMT tomorrow were to put on P500 a game about illegal salmon poaching, that there would be an enormous outcry from hobby wargamers complaining about that. So I want to ask about professional war games, in a sphere in which that term might be applied more broadly than it is in the hobby space. What kinds of, and what are is the kind of landscape look like in terms of non-military subjects, like, for example, illegal salmon poaching or those types of things that maybe the hobby war gamer would get all, that's not a war game, you can't do that, and I am offended.
Is this your backhanded way of asking what is a war game?
Yes, and we can even talk about Twilight Struggle if you want. It kind of is, because in the simulative context, the kinds of things that you're doing can be applied to non-military topics as well. So let me ask about that. I'll start with you, Andrew. But all your stuff is
the
all
oldest question
classified,
wargaming for the newbie. I see how it is. So again, I have of the things that I have worked on, they have been both, blowing dudes up and putting dudes on a map, and more strategic questions. Something that people might not think about as a wargaming topic, right, is playing out the challenge of authorities in government context. Who reports to who gets budget lines, how does the weird negotiations about who gets to have what toy, or how do things get funded, are all questions that really matter to governments. That does our structure, the way we have set up this command, or we set up this organization, function well? Have we set it up such that the foxes guarding the hen house is a topic that sometimes I hadn't known about before coming in, but it was an area that I've run into a couple of war games. And so the challenge, it becomes who's got money to fund professional wargaming, because it's cost a fair amount of money to run, research and run and develop. And whatever your opinion about the matter, the DoD's got a lot of money to fund this, and so a lot of the games therefore focus on the questions that national security experts want to look at, because they're the ones funding the research study, and therefore the purpose is to look at the question they want. I had the opportunity to run some games for the State Department. Those were looking more at diplomatic questions about influence, building relationships, and different nations' equities in supply chains or technology pathways, which isn't really about war, but it is about important, serious geopolitical topics. So you don't always have to be about, I'm going to, sticking warheads on foreheads, to think about the wider systemic questions of geopolitics or about governance, that we would still qualify as a war game in this particular case.
Sebastian?
Yeah, so Brant knows that I have a pretty wide Big Ten approach when it comes to war game and what that definition is. And that's partly because of the bias that I sit in as a professional game designer, right? So like our team at CNA is called the Gaming and Integration Team. We're not called the Wargaming Team, even though we often colloquially call ourselves the Wargamers and Wargaming Team, because our work is not exclusive to the wargaming side. Although a large chunk of our work is because we work so predominantly for the Navy and Marine Corps, that we do many of those kind of topics that most people think of, like hex encounters and blocks and operational warfighting and logistics and air power, all that stuff. We do that, right? But also what other people don't appreciate, right, often is because the shadow that the DoD and Navy and Marine Corps cast, right, in terms of how big of a presence they are in the room. that Andrew sort of mentioned is that we also do other things. Like I did a hurricane response and resiliency game last year, right? Things on infrastructure, things on climate change, things on my IU fishing was one of my favorite games that I designed this year because there's such a wicked hard problem and so fascinating and has such also security dimensions to it as well, right? Which I didn't appreciate until I started really working and reading and designing the game itself, right?
I'd love to see the CRT from that game.
Yeah. So there is
Boat
violence,
explodes.
right? No, so boats sink in our game. There's violence that happens between. It's essentially an economic engine game where the fish are the scarcity, and there are ways that the Coast Guard's trying to catch you to do illegal things, right? And you're destroying the environment as you're trying to get economic, hit like victory points and so forth. So it's like it's something that you would recognize if you played it, right? But it is also a part of it was like based in a lot of research and work that we did prior to the game and during the game design. So for me, the distinction is less important for us as a gaming team, right? We're just like, hey, what is your purpose? Is it educational, analytical, somewhere in between, exploratory, and so forth, right? That's what we care about from our professional side, right? And also, if I put on my hobby hat, right, like there are reasons you care about the distinction between wargaming and other board games and so forth, right? And there are community lines, but like even amongst our team, we have a pretty wide set of people who have different interests, right? Like we have people who are like seeped into the D&D RPG like tabletop RPG like culture, right? And that's where their background as designers come from. Other times there are people who are like hardcore political scientists or regionalists who have been converted in their professional careers later on, and they have less like commercial gaming experience, right? And then there are like people like myself and Andrew who are like more hex and counter potentially, or your traditional wargaming, line of things that you play, right? Like Advanced Squad Leader and Axis and Allies and War Room, which I just played recently, or Triumph and Tragedy, stuff like that, right? Or U-Boat, right? I just said that to piss off Brant.
Yeah, I know. It's a weakness. That's
right?
not a war game, damn it. It doesn't even have a map.
Right, but it has an awesome submarine anyway.
It does have a cool cardboard submarine,
right? But the point is that what are you trying to do with your game, right? You know what I mean? And sometimes we will use words that are reflective of our sponsors, right? Sometimes we're like, hey, you go to an organization, we're like, really don't want to use the word wargaming, right? Because we're like a advocacy group, or we're a university, and we're sort of uncomfortable like with the potential connotations that we may be supporting XYZ, right? So we can call it peace gaming or serious gaming or like crisis simulation, whatever you want to call it, right?
Simulation,
right, whatever you may want to call it, right? And also sometimes it's differs even among the professional community and what their focus is, right? So I think the whole debate is sort of like, it's like semantics, right? I'm more of a practical, like, what is it that you want to do with this game, right? And that's how I approach it, mainly because it lets me go to sleep at night pretty easily and wake up in the morning, right?
So Brant, what would you like to add?
Whenever like like the Taiwan game that showed up on NBC, whenever those things show up, you get all kinds of hobbyist knuckleheads that are sitting in the background going, just play Next War Taiwan. Never mind that the professionals are not going to sit down and absorb the rules for Next War Taiwan. Congressperson
so-and-so
exactly.
is not going to spend his weekend reading the advanced air rules from Next War Taiwan.
So when Sebastian's talking about this fishing game, I want to channel those inner hobbyist knuckleheads and yell, just play COD Wars. It already exists. Just to poke at Sebastian a little bit. Overall, I think you're going to see it goes back to that purpose thing that Andrew and Sebastian have mentioned over and over. What are the tools you need to achieve your purpose? Sometimes you need an actual rigid CRT. Sometimes it's enough to have a much fuzzier level of adjudication because you're more concerned with the questions that are coming out of the exercise than you are with actual hardcore data. And so it could be, all right, in order to further this exploration, we're going to pretend that X has happened. And now let's just move on so that you can get to the real questions that you're trying to answer. In some of the cases, some of the things that I had worked on, that they were not hardcore military We weren't trying to adjudicate a lot of combat granularity. It was enough to say that sort of influence in this area had shifted one way or another. But when you're working on a game of a strategic level counterinsurgency, which was one of the bigger projects that I'd done for multiple years there, you can't shoot your way out of an insurgency. I mean, this is not a new concept to folks. And so the idea that in addition to spending money to help do things during an insurgency, you also had to spend some political capital was an important lesson that we wanted people to learn. And so the magic CRT, as it were, that really drove a lot of big results in the game we were dealing with was more an investment in time and energy and effort than it was an investment in bullets. And that was the CRT, as it were, was more of the economic investment. And I know there's a bunch of grogs now rolling their eyes going, damn it, that's a Euro game.
Oh, grognards never do that.
Yeah. There was certainly an economic investment needed in the military aspect of things, but in this case, you could reduce the amount of shooting you had to do by making a better investment in the community. And that was borne out by a variety of research that had gone into the model that we were handed to build. And so again, that wasn't research we had to do. That was research our sponsor handed us, but pretty well meticulously researched. And so that CRT wasn't a CRT of, Andrew's great term, warheads on foreheads. It was the economic engine that mattered. And the players weren't told that up front. Part of the point of the game was for them to figure it out as it happened.
Just to clarify, I mean CRT, like combat results table, right?
Correct. Yeah.
Just making sure.
Right. For a war
a
game
couple of
audience,
things nowadays. Want to make sure we don't lose
delineate
good heavens, that's true.
Critical race theory.
Yeah, it stands for at least three things, two of which are not the topics that we talk about on this channel.
Yeah.
So let me get us to it like a second or last question, and I'll start with you, Brant, because you're the person that probably has to deal with the sort of sweltering waters of the hobby wargaming community more than anybody else. What would you like the hobby wargamer to know about professional wargaming and why professional wargaming happens the way it happens? What do you want them to understand about the professional side of wargaming?
There is a weird dichotomy in professional wargaming that I think would really sort of hurt the brains of a lot of the hardcore hobbyists. And that is that the situations that the professionals are often exploring are far more complex than most hobby wargames are going to explore. A lot of interconnected models, a lot of wide-ranging explorations of topics that bring in, huge amounts of complexity that far exceed let's refight Gettysburg. And even the level of granularity that OCS games bring to the table is not nearly as complex as a lot of the interconnected things at the high operational and strategic level that the pros are examining. And yet the pros have to do it with 1/10 the rule set that you're going to find in most hobby war games. So they have an immense amount of complexity that they really have to distill down into something very tight and compact. And that's a hard tightrope to walk. It really is. And a lot of hobbyists will look at the kinds of things that the pros are getting at and shake their head and go, God, there's no way you can do all it, without understanding the purpose behind it. The purpose isn't always play this game and the guy that wins gets promoted, right? I mean, there's a couple of knuckleheads on BGG that are like, every quarter you should be having war games and the guys that win are the guys that get promoted. It's like, dude, go away. Like there are 1,000 other things that you use war games for that aren't
go to WBC.
Yeah.
Get that out of your system.
That aren't just this, bleep measuring contest. Like that's not what they're for. They're to do a ton of other things. But it's a very tough tightrope for these guys to walk. And unless you really understand the purpose of what the professionals are trying to get at, trying to critique the methods and processes that they're using to get there is really a fool's errand. I mean, it's the height of arrogance for hobbyists to look at it and go, well, they should just be doing this other thing instead. You have no idea what it is they're trying to do. Like, if you're training for a race, they should just train this way. Dude, you're watching them jog for endurance, and the guy's actually a swimmer. Like, don't tell him how to train for his swimming race by improving his running technique. Just back up, and not a lot of hobby war gamers have that perspective. And quite frankly, a lot of them don't want it.
Your hate mail can be addressed to Brant at Armchair Dragons.
Yeah, send it. I don't care. Send it. Like, I've been in both worlds long enough to have seen this. So,
Sebastian,
that's my big nugget out of all of this.
Thank you. Sebastian, what would you like hobby wargamers to know about professional wargaming and the way it works and the way it happens?
Very rarely do we get to choose what we wargame and the scope in which we examine a topic, right? So let's say you come to me and you're like, hey, I'm an engineer and I work for the Navy and I want to look at the ship design in this sort of operational context, blah, 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 right? Because I have a wider analytical policy, budgetary, whatever decision, right, that this thing needs to plug into, right? War games don't exist in vacuums. They exist within politics of organizations, but also wider efforts of acquisitions, budgets, operational concepts, and so forth, right? Or even exercises or other forms of analysis. So one thing I would remind people is that like war games are scoped for a reason. Not to say there are not bad games. There are definitely bad professional games out there. And if you want to know which one they are, just like ask me privately and I will tell you, right? But the reason for a lot of times we scope certain things is because there's a specific question, an analytical or educational objective that we're trying to hit with our players, with our organization, with our research, right? Because we need to hit it, right? Because that is the outcome that we need, not in the sense of the outcome on the board, but in the sense of the learning that would happen, the question that we need to answer, right? So for example, if we're like, hey, we need to look at, let's say what Andrew said earlier is like, we need to know if this weapon system's different ranges, whether it's 5,000 kilometers, whether it's 500 kilometers, or whether 50 kilometers really makes a difference in how and why, right? Well, that means that game has to have a scenario that makes that dynamic important, right? Because not all dynamics or situations will have that kind of importance, right? So you scope it and you scope the scenario to have that question be the central element of your game, right? Not because because it's going to be the most fun, right? Some of our games are not the most fun. Like some of our games in the past are like a lot of math, Excel, like logistics, punching in like gallons of fuel. Like, hey, my carrier has consumed like X number of gallons of fuel today, and X number of like JP5 like jet fuel, and X number of like portable water, right? Like all this stuff, right? And sometimes we do it because we have a purpose and scope and an objective and destination in mind in terms of the outcome and the information that we're trying to get a gleam or right, throughout the process, right? So it's not just we do it for funsies, right? There is a purpose in a wider or institutional way, in a wider analytical context or educational context, right? So like, for instance, even on the educational side, one of the things, some like Next Word Taiwan, right? Like people are like, why don't you just use Next Word Taiwan for like these majors to teach them how to do this? I'm like, well, because when I used to teach at Command and General Staff College, I have like 2.5 hours with them, and I only have them for like once a week, right? So just to teach them the rule set is just like mind-boggling effort, right? And I also have like 18 students, so like there's only one of me. How many sets do I need? How many people can I run it with, right? Like, is it worth the squeeze, right? So you have to understand the context of why I'm doing something, right? And that chooses the method, the tools, and the approach that you will end up using as a designer and as a researcher.
Andrew, what would you like hobby wargamers to know?
I think one is that this is a profession if you're able, as someone who just recently got into it, as an olive branch, if you're interested in these kind of questions about how do you design to educate, how do you design to fill a purpose, how do you break really complex topics down to simple abstractions that get to the point, that it's a great place to be, and I've enjoyed it. I'll hammer or kind of re-hit a point that Brant makes, that the point isn't to win. In fact, it's more important that you lose, and you lose well, and lose in a way that gives us information, right? If you're wargaming a potential contingency, it's more important that you lose and figure out how you're insufficiently prepared for whatever that scenario is, than win. So a kind of attorney style promotion ladder is going to create a whole bunch of people, very overconfident people, and underprepared systems for that.
See also Japanese Navy 1942.
And Sebastian's one of our mugs at the office on one side say, "Don't fight the scenario," because the thing we have to say to players a lot, that the reason this scenario is happening is so that we can look at the thing. And yes, there are 15 other ways the world might work that could or could not bring us to this point in time, but not bringing it. And then as a final olive branch, a lot of the tools that we use to make these abstractions are drawn either wholesale or with modification from other games, right? If you're looking for a combat results table, there's a lot of things that have done combat results tables very well that you can draw from. If you're looking for systems by which to activate units with a limited amount of command power, there's a lot of systems already that do that. If you're looking to scope an economy, you're not going to come up one wholesale. You're going to look at the games you've played before. So a lot of the work that we do is powered by wider hobby or wargaming or board gaming overall. And so to some extent, we do build on that space to do the kind of work that we do.
Okay, fantastic. So before we go, I would like to mention that Sebastian, who is now going to leverage his many, many years of experience as a professional wargame designer, and let me know if I'm mispresenting Littoral Commander as a commercial war game, but I believe you're about to release your first commercial war game, or is it out already? Let's talk about that.
So Littoral Commander, formerly known as Fleet Marine Force or FMF, will be coming out later this year. If you're like, why did you change the name? Like, let's talk offline, all right?
Link in the video description.
Yeah. It is with the Dietz Foundation. It is available for pre-order. Very excitingly, we sent all the files to the printer, and it's we're very excited to get our first batch of prototype copies, and then off to the races we go. And we hope to get them out into people's hands really soon. There are some early prototypes that I made on my kitchen room table that are out in the fleet and the Marine Corps and the Army and other places when we were first designing this game. And the game was originally designed as a unit-based educational war game, right? Like, I wanted to design a game for former Sergeant Bay, right? I wanted him to be able to play with his sergeants and his corporals and his gunnies, right? And be able to have majors and captains within their batteries and their companies and their battalions run this game for them and look at the possibilities that future warfare has for the Marine Corps and the Joint Force withal, right? So it really is a sort of tactical game that has operational flavor in it, and I'm really excited about it because it's been amazing to be able to spearhead this sort of educational grassroots effort within the Joint Force and within PME schools, and like we collaborate with I remember asking Marine commanders, like I was like a buddy of mine, I was like, hey man, I have this war game, do you want to like test it with me and see if it's useful to your Marines or so and so? And it's been amazing, the response, right? Like, there are Marines who are sending me emails of like, hey, we played this game, or we set up this tournament with your game, or we adapted this rule. I remember one of the engineering battalions, they were like, hey, we don't like that the engineering cards only do one thing, which is remove mines. We do so many more things, so we added all these 6 cards, right? Like expedition or airfield repair, obstacle removal, obstacle like construction, right? All this stuff, like hardening of battlefield positions. I was like, and because they play the game, they added all these features in their cards, and that's what I wanted with the game. I wanted the game to be fun and enjoyable and educate the average game designer, the average citizen, and so forth, but also be malleable and be able to bend and sort of adapt to the places, whether it finds itself at a kitchen room table, right? Or if it finds itself at, a unit in, doing, training about tactical leadership, right? And HIMARS and so forth, right? So the game is really looking at Force Design 2030 for the Marine Corps and how it's looking at readapting itself for the future fight against pure adversaries. I'm really excited about it. Like, the cards look amazing. And the maps are fantastic. We have the Ryukyus, Taiwan, Singapore, and Northern Luzon, right? So in the Philippines. And our hope is that this is going to be part of a wider series. I already started working on some ideas for the sequel and like follow-on projects. I have sort of grand ambitions for this series, and hopefully people will really love it. And more than anything, I'm really excited for people to make scenarios for themselves and adapt the game, and I want people to bend and shape it as they want and need, right? How Brant may use it at conventions may be very different from how a commander in a battery may use it, right? It's been really and that's what I've loved so far about the process. I'm really looking forward to it. But one thing I will say though is that game is like a personal pet project of myself and not related to CNA. It's just something that I did in the pandemic because I couldn't bake bread, and I was stuck in my indoors. I was like, oh, design games, because work and pleasure are the same, right? But I'm really excited about it.
Awesome.
Gary,
And
this is the part where this is the part where we get to lean on Sebastian to like show up at Origins next year with the promise of setting aside a table. The showcase table we had Song for War on this past year, we will set aside for Littoral Commander, and Sebastian can set it up and leave it up all weekend, and we will get 6 or 7 sessions on the calendar and just go up and do nothing but that all weekend long at Origins.
And I will point out that I can confirm that Littoral Commander is significantly cheaper than your average Defense Department war game.
Oh yeah.
So,
you do not even know the number that we that is required.
I'm sure that's classified.
Though he didn't
I don't even want to know.
Right.
It is the most fun you'll have losing an Aegis fleet off the Philippines.
Yeah.
So
I'll notice Sebastian didn't say no to Origins.
No, so honestly, there's a lot of game conventions that I've always wanted to go. Like Origins is one of those things that I've always wanted to go. I've never been able to find my way there, mainly because teaching schedules and prep work, and the summer is really busy for us.
And Brant's there.
And Brant's there, right?
Yeah.
But
got to deal with that.
Yeah, so one of those things that we're trying to juggle, that even Andrew and I, like one of the things we'll do in the coming weeks is sort of set our schedules of what conferences, what events that we're trying to support this year. Like, for example, obviously we have our own Connections conference that Brant mentioned earlier here in the NCR, in the National Capital Region. I'll be supporting Connections UK and Sandhurst this year with our British colleagues. And then there are a couple of Marine Corps specific events that I'm trying to support, but I'm trying to find time in the calendar, right, to go to Origins and other events. Like, I love HistoriCon, right? So I try to make it up there for one of those whenever I can. Our team really likes going to PAX because it's so close in Philly, and it's like a weekend, so it's an easy lift for us. So if you're in PAX Unplugged this year, let us know. A lot of our team will be there at least one or if not all the days. I was there all last year, and I was like, yes, let's just play games. And it was fantastic because our VP is like absolute savage at like Ticket to Ride. So it's pretty awesome.
All right. I would love to thank all of you esteemed guests for coming on. So Andrew, Sebastian, and Brant, thanks so much for agreeing to be on here. I think we got some great questions asked, and I hope that we'll be able to shed a little bit of light for the hobby war gamer on the world of professional war games. So thanks Andrew, Sebastian, and Brant, and thank you for watching.